The problem is, or a problem is that, the neo-Keynesian argument for globalization was always that, yeah, you're going to have 10 or 15, maybe 20 years of mercantilism where we're going to offshore labor and we're going to redistribute the types of jobs that are done onshore versus offshore. And companies are going to get more efficient. But then those mercantilist economies are going to turn into first world consumer driven economies. And we're going to have a virtuous cycle where, yeah, labor is going to suffer for 10 or 15 years, but eventually we are going to specialize in higher value, we being the first world will specialize in higher value production, and we will sell that higher value production to a new first world middle class that has emerged as a function of sort of climbing out of mercantilism into a normal kind of developed consumer-led Western economy, right? And I guess one of the big challenges is that China especially never outgrew its mercantilist roots, right? And so, they've put a cap on their exchange rate. They have never introduced policies that incentivize consumption. They've always ran their economy as, a managed economy largely built on investment, government-led investment in infrastructure and production. And so that virtuous cycle never took hold, right? And so now we're left with a hollowed out manufacturing base in many Western democracies, and the other side of the equation has not materialized. And in the middle of this recognition, we've got, at all points alert that maybe we aren't globally as friendly as we all thought we were, that maybe we can't depend on Russia to export the commodities that we need for this globalization cycle to persist. Maybe we can't count on China to produce the goods that we need, maybe it's strategic goods, or maybe just regular everyday goods if they're going to go into lockdowns to prevent, to implement a zero COVID type policy, right? So you're now shifting from this vision of maximizing efficiency to a vision to maximize resiliency, and that requires a complete revisioning of the operation of the global economy, which is also highly inflationary, I think.
Yeah, and that's not a coincidence. Those things are not independent factors, right? The unwind of globalization is very much correlated with inflation, right? When inflation happens, the populace are unhappy. They want more. And the wealthy in a country are not willing to give up more. So generally the solution is, well, let's take it from our competitors, the other people outside the system. And it ends up being, and this is what started with Donald Trump, right? The the counter China, the tariffs, et cetera.
Yeah.
That was a populist impulse, right? And that's naturally what happens. There's a xenophobia that develops and a blaming of others. It becomes everybody's scrambling over, limited, what's perceived as limited supply. And that forces less globalization, which forces even more inflation, right? But these are all a rebalancing, right? The people who the have-nots wanting to have again and not willing to settle without it. And that rebalancing means, the people in China who were working for less and getting better wages, right? They're going to have to see some of that unwind. And those people aren't willing to go backwards. And so there's this push and pull that leads to, and eventually it becomes, if a country or an entity is in a point of weakness, it makes them existentially scared, and it generally causes them to lash out. Mm-hmm. It's why Germany lashed out after Weimar Germany, right? Inflation drove World War II. People forget, what drove it. If you look at Russia, if you look at China, they have massive demographic problems. China is going to go from 1.2 billion to 700 million people in the next 25 years. They lose 500 million people in population. They have unsecure means of technology and the inputs that they need in terms of microprocessors. They have not enough commodities for the consumption that they need, even at 700 million. They are completely commodity insecure. and they have great aspirations, right? And so you pair this proud country with great aspirations, with vulnerability in a time of inflation and stress, and you get what we're getting now. Same with Russia. Russia's a massive demographic decline. Yes, they have commodities, right? But they've been hemmed in, and they've been, they have been in significant demographic decline. Not just demographic, but a decline otherwise. And so and again, I would argue that if China wasn't willing to back Russia, Russia never would have done this, right? And so that general fear and angst that comes from these two entities that are actually the countries that are in the most demographic decline as a group, most at risk by the West trying to reshore their middle class and deal with populism. We're also, as the U.S. dollar, we're going to be able to export a significant amount of inflation, right? We'll be able to control inflation by a stronger dollar, ultimately making things cheaper to import, and we're going to export that inflation. Historically, during these times, look at 97, 98, right? When we were raising interest rates and dollar strength happens, what happens? You get emerging market crises. You get the Chinese, the Asian crisis. You get the Russian ruble crisis. Dollar-denominated debt blows up. And not to mention these autocracies generally aren't as flexible as the democracies in the West. And they lead to real people with pitchforks in the streets as opposed to people.
Major regime changes.
So, I mean, it's not a surprise. During times of inflation, these things happen. They're not just correlated. They are structurally connected. And so you should expect that in the next 5 to 10 years, there'll be a lot of new lines on maps. I wouldn't be shocked if we are in World War III going forward. I know that's scary, and that means something different than what World War II is. We're at a very different time. There'll be very different effects, but there's real competition happening in the world right now, and a need to preserve long-term existential angst. That is driving a lot of these. So these all, it's a negative feedback loop, like I mentioned, and it works in so many ways. But you can't go 40 years in a benevolent cycle and deviate that far from an equilibrium and not expect, what we're about to kind of